I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mimi. Um, she works at the Ecology Action Centre in Halifax. Mimi is the Wetlands and Water Coordinator at the EAC. So in this role, she acts as an environmental watchdog by engaging in research, community outreach, and advocacy related to the protection of freshwater and wetlands in Nova Scotia, but also across Canada. Um, this role includes involvement in campaigns regarding freshwater and wetlands policy, protected areas, nature-based climate solution, and climate change adaptation approaches. Mimi also works on the EAC's coastal team. The coastal team's focus is on coastal climate change adaptation. So the coastal team has been part of advocating for and supporting the Coastal Protection Act for over a decade. And I think that we're all aware that that is on hiatus, hopefully temporarily, but Mimi is working and advocating for the Protection Act ongoing. And Mimi's here to talk to us a little bit about her work that she does at the EAC and maybe a little bit about what we can do as citizens to support that work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you everyone for having me. I'm really excited to be here and happy Earth Day. I have to say I am a huge animal lover, so I encourage pets to also be part of this meeting. I know I've already seen a couple, so if you have pets, definitely bring them. So before I begin, I do want to start with a land acknowledgement, and I'd like to acknowledge that we're living in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. In Mi'kma'ki, we are surrounded by thousands of kilometers of coastline. We are here today to discuss the coastal areas and coastal lands. The Mi'kmaq people are the original caretakers of these lands and these shorelines. Before colonizers began to section off and privatize the land, the coast was a place of free movement for the Mi'kmaq. For generations and long before European colonization, the Mi'kmaq have understood that the coast is dynamic and always changing, and they have lived in a way that respects this. The Mi'kmaq have also known the importance of stewarding lands and doing so collectively. It's everyone's responsibility to care for the land, the water, and the coast. It's important to remember that had we as settlers listened to the perspectives of Indigenous people, we would not be in the climate crisis that we are now faced with. We are here because of the way colonizers and colonial institutions have neglected the land, extracted from the land, and objectified the land. So this is a reminder that as we work on environmental issues and discuss the topics that we're covering today, we also must uplift Indigenous voices and perspectives and show up for fights for Indigenous sovereignty and the right for the original caretakers of this land to make decisions over this land. So as Anne mentioned, I'm from the Ecology Action Centre, so EAC for short. We're located in the north end of Kjipuktuk, so in Halifax, just on Fern Lane. I work on two teams, as Anne mentioned, so I'm more on the wilderness team, and then I'm also on the coastal and water team. And I mainly focus on wetland and freshwater concerns. But the coastal team, so it's me and my colleague Nicholas. Nick is the main coastal person, but he was double booked tonight, so I'm taking this presentation. So I am going to be focusing on the coast, and I do have a lot of knowledge, but that's not necessarily my forte. So if you have very specific questions or comments, I will do my best to answer them to the best of my knowledge, but I may have to come back with a more nuanced answer for you either tomorrow or later this week. So at EAC, we have 7 different action teams. So I'm on the coastal team and the wilderness team. We also do transportation issues and energy issues, food issues, and built environment issues. Oh, and marine issues as well. So those are our 7 teams. We're about 40 or 50 staff right now, about 4,000 members, and over 300 volunteers. So we do work mainly on advocacy and policy analysis. So not so much boots on the ground work, but a lot of policy and research work. So paying very close attention to what government and industry is doing and being that public mouthpiece. So communicating to the public how we feel the government and industry is doing on those fronts. So praising where praise is deserved, but also being critical where that's warranted as well. So today we're here to talk about coastal adaptation and coastal protection. So I'm just going to give a bit of a baseline about coastal climate change in Nova Scotia. This may not be news to you. In fact, I would guess that all of you probably know most of this information anyway, but I do want to cover it because it is important. So Nova Scotia has a lot of coastline, almost 13,000 kilometers of coastline, which is quite unbelievable. And unlike other provinces, for example, PEI, which is just a really large sandbank, the coastline of Nova Scotia is quite varied. So we have sand in some places, cliffs, rocky, cobble, basically every type of coastline, you'll find it here in Nova Scotia. So it is quite varied. The coast is also really important to our identity and our culture. Of course, this is no surprise to any of us, but about 70% of people in Nova Scotia live in a coastal community. So that's quite significant. Nova Scotia as a province is experiencing the highest level of relative sea level rise. So obviously the seas are rising everywhere, but in Nova Scotia, we are actually sinking because of glacial activity or previous glacial activity. So as the seas are rising, the land is sinking. So that's why we have the highest level of relative sea level rise compared to other provinces and territories in Canada. And the seas are rising for two primary reasons. One, most people know that the glaciers are melting. Antarctica is melting, Greenland is melting. The other reason is that as water warms, it expands. That's all matter. That's just basic physics. But so even if all of the glaciers were to melt, the water would still keep expanding and the seas would keep rising. So in terms of coastal climate change signs that we're seeing here in Nova Scotia, we're seeing more frequent and severe storms, so things like hurricanes. We're also seeing higher levels of coastal erosion and saltwater intrusion. Now, it's important to note that these things would probably happen anyway, but it's the rate and severity at which they're happening, which is quite alarming, and those are the impacts of climate change. Yeah, so sometimes when we have these discussions about coastal protection, the immediate reaction is, oh, we have to stop these changes. But the coast is a dynamic place and change has always happened. And we do need to respect that change, but also face the reality that the changes that we're seeing are happening at an alarming rate. Given what we know that we need swift and meaningful action to adapt. So climate change mitigation, of course, is really important. But climate change is here. We're already feeling the impacts of it. So that adaptation piece is really key as well. So here's a question that I want to just reflect on is what changes caused by climate change have you seen in your communities? Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
So until almost 3 years ago now, actually, I lived in Regatta Point. And there's a seawalk around Regatta Point, which is actually one of HRM's parks. And I lived there I actually moved in there originally in 1994. And the erosion on that seawalk over those 30 years has been astonishing. And not just the erosion, you could, of course, see when there were surges because the water would come up on shore and it would leave all its detritus along the shore. And that water line, or that detritus line, is further and further inland now. And of course, causing the seawalk to erode further and further. It's due for renovation, for lack of a better word, just like, and it's part of the renovation of two other seawalks, which was the Horseshoe Island and the Dingle. And the same thing needs to happen in Regatta Point, but I have no idea when it's going to happen. I don't live there now, so I'm not involved. I'm not far away, and I I still wander down there pretty regularly. But yeah, it's been astonishing to see the changes down there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I used to live in that area as well, and this was before I knew about a lot of these things because I'm from Ontario. Don't hate me for that, but
So am I. It's okay.
okay, perfect. Yeah, I just obviously I knew about climate change, but coastal climate change specifically, I didn't know a lot about. So when I first moved down to Regatta Point, yeah, I just thought that that's what it looked like, and then the more I learned, the more I was aware of like, yeah, you can definitely see those changes
Oh
here.
yeah, big
Thank-
time.
Thanks for sharing, Thomas. I see your hand up.
Yeah, I have two observations. My aunt has a place in Malagash, which is on the North Shore, and they're much more sandy, probably more similar to PEI. And with the frequency of extreme storms or hurricanes, they can see their coastline on a yearly basis changing. So it's not something you would need to look at with pictures. You can actually just look out and say that tree is now awful close to the edge, or more the edge is closer to the tree.
Mm.
And then also from my experience on the South Shore of Nova Scotia, also again with the frequencies of these storms, we're seeing we have a dock, and the times at which the water is up to the top of the dock or over, we can almost count a couple times a year now that's happening, and that was just never a thing that I remember, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, very alarming stuff. Thank you for sharing, Anne.
My in-laws live in eastern PEI, and their property is on the very edge of the island, the eastern tip. And when I first met my husband about 20 years ago, when we went to their property, we could easily play soccer on their yard or throw a frisbee and do any of those sorts of activities. But the cliff edge has been eroding at such a rate, they're losing about a foot to a foot and a half every year. And now the edge is probably 30, 40 feet away from the house. So they're looking into what it would take to actually have their home raised and a new foundation poured further back so they can move the house back because they're just running out of land.
Yeah. Yeah, retreat is one of the most effective ways to adapt to coastal climate change for sure. And I think we're going to see that more and more. And it's probably the best way that they can be protecting their house, but it is expensive as well. So
Yeah, and they've
yeah.
tried all kinds of things like planting different deep-rooted plants along the cliff edge and going down the cliff, but the water is actually scooping the sand out from below. And so it's taking the sand from below, and every time we have a big storm, it's a significant section, and then the land that's remaining above falls down this.
Yeah. Wow. Very, very frightening, but thank you for sharing, Anne. Okay, so I'm going to dive a little bit into the Coastal Protection Act now, because this has been a huge part of EAC's work for well over a decade now. So the Coastal Protection Act is the first of its kind in Canada. It is very much the first step of coastal climate change in Nova Scotia. It is a piece of legislation, and it would do three main things. So it provide protection for coastal ecosystems. It would eliminate inappropriate coastal development, and it would preserve the dynamic and resilient nature of our coasts to better withstand climate change. So how does it do that? It would do that in a couple different ways. So it would define different types of coastal zones. So it had coastal zone A and coastal zone B. The nuances for this conversation don't matter too much, but it would set minimum horizontal setbacks and then minimum building elevations. So it would only regulate buildings that are being built. So it isn't going to regulate buildings that are already built. So if you already have your house on the coast, this piece of legislation wouldn't touch it. It was just for new builds. And it would also regulate construction of some shore stabilizing structures that were below the high water mark. So essentially, this act is meant to protect homes, protect ecosystems, and to protect taxpayer money, because it's a lot more expensive to rebuild and go through all of the insurance stuff as opposed to just not building in a safe place, or in an unsafe place, sorry, from the get-go. So there is an analogy that I like to use where we can think of the Coastal Protection Act almost like fire codes. You just want to know that your house is going to be safe and that it's up to code. And you also want to know that your next door neighbor's house is up to code and that it's not unsafe, because their house being unsafe could mean that your house is unsafe or that your community is unsafe. So these are two examples of builds that the Coastal Protection Act, if it were in place and these builds tried to happen now or after the Coastal Protection Act took place, would not be allowed. So you can see how close these two homes are to the shoreline. And both of these photos, I think, were taken in 2021 or 2022, so they're fairly recent. The one on the left makes me, I mean, both of them make me nervous, but the one on the left makes me particularly nervous. That is so close to the water. And if a hurricane came through during high tide, I would not want to be in that building. Or any storm, really, because that is quite frightening. So timeline of the Coastal Protection Act, or the CPA for short. So this is something that had been in the works in Nova Scotia for a long time, not necessarily as a CPA itself, but the building blocks were there from the 1970s. So in 1976, Nova Scotia was one of the first provinces in Canada to introduce coastal zone management. And this was done through a group of professionals with an executive director for coastal zone issues. And then in the mid-2000s, something called Coastal 2000 was launched, and it was a provincial coastal planning process that received a lot of support in terms of morale and people wanting it to happen, but it did not receive support financially. So it didn't go very far. And then late in the 2000s, groundwork for the CPA began. 2017 is when the ball really got rolling on the CPA, and a lot of work was being done by both people in the government, but also coastal allies and coastal professionals outside of the government. They were collaborating on what the Coastal Protection Act should look like. And EAC was there throughout that whole process. So we were one of the groups that was being consulted with and collaborating with the government and the other professionals on this piece of legislation. And then 2019 was a huge year because the Coastal Protection Act received full party support and received royal assent. So that was awesome. It meant the CPA was finally a piece of legislation. It wasn't enforced and it wasn't implemented, but it existed as a piece of legislation. So what needed to happen next was the regulations needed to be developed. And once the regulations were developed, then the act could be proclaimed and enforced. And then in 2021, significant public consultation was carried out, and across the board, we saw that people wanted the Coastal Protection Act and they wanted coastal protection. Also in 2021, this is when we shifted as a province from a liberal to progressive conservative government. That was, at the time, that wasn't a concern because back in 2019, all of the parties had agreed that the Coastal Protection Act should be a thing. Then in 2022, we saw Hurricane Fiona, which of course was devastating for Atlantic Canada. That was felt here as well in Nova Scotia. And in the days and weeks after the hurricane, we saw a lot of media press from the government, specifically the Minister of Environment, saying, yes, Fiona is a perfect example of why we need the Coastal Protection Act. In 2022, the government also released their climate plan, again saying, yes, the Coastal Protection Act will have its regulations and will be enacted or implemented. Delays kept on happening. We weren't really sure why. And then in 2023, the government announced that the regulations would come out in July 2023 or 2025, sorry. And then in October, another public consultation was put out. This one was a little bit, yeah, we weren't sure what to make of this one because public consultations had already been done and people said, yeah, we want the CPA. But again, yeah, the government said, okay, that's fine. We heard you. But the questions in this consultation were like a little bit leading. So it was things like, who do you think should be in charge of making rules about the coast? That is provincial jurisdiction, so it should be them. So those questions were a little bit strange. But then in 2024, at the beginning, so in February, the government announced that it was not going to proclaim the CPA. So that was a really disappointing moment for a lot of folks. Instead, they released a 3-year plan. And in this plan, it essentially offloaded all the responsibility from the provincial government to municipalities and also to individual landowners. In the backlash of this, the government had a few reasons why they said that they weren't going to proclaim it. One of them being that they said that they sent over 40,000 questionnaires to coastal landowners asking them about their support for the CPA. And this in itself, we heard from a lot of folks that they didn't receive this. So they said that they sent 40,000, but we've heard from people that said that they didn't receive it or they weren't sure where to access it. Out of the 40,000 that were sent, the government heard from 1,000 people. And most of those answers said, yes, we still want the CPA. And then in media interviews, the minister said that, you know, while yes, the 1,000 people said we wanted the CPA, or most of the 1,000 people said we wanted the CPA, we didn't hear from 39,000. So that means that most people didn't actually support it that strongly. So this was a really upsetting moment for a lot of folks. Sorry, there we go. And there was a lot of backlash and reaction, not just from EAC. I mean, EAC, of course, reacted, but this was a cross-provincial reaction, and it wasn't just an environmental reaction. It was a public safety reaction. It was a reaction of feeling like the democratic process wasn't being followed because people wanted the CPA and they had voted for the government, thinking that the CPA would be enacted. So those first few weeks was quite chaotic. There was a storm of media interviews and articles. There was a province-wide reach out to MLAs, Minister Hallman, who's the Minister of Environment, and Premier Houston. There was a reformation of the Coastal Coalition. So this was something that had been formed while the CPA had been being developed, and then there wasn't really a need for it, so it fizzled out. They reformed. There was a really large cross-provincial sign campaign. You might have seen Coastal Protection Act Now signs across the province or even in your neighborhood. Mm-hmm. There was a protest in front of the legislature. This one was really impressive. I think it was on a Wednesday at like 10 a.m. So a time that you wouldn't think a lot of people would come out, but hundreds of people came out to show support. And there was also a petition. This was run by the Coastal Coalition, but they were getting a lot of signatures on that petition. So very impressive. And even today, so that was, you know, over a year ago now, but even today, there is still ongoing momentum around this. So the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities have still been quite active in keeping this conversation alive. And I guess it was in the winter, I want to say around December, there was some media coverage about NSFM talking about, yeah, how they still want that provincial legislation and how they feel like having 49, because there's 49 municipalities, having 49 different bylaws from all the different municipalities seems like not the most efficient way to protect our coasts. During the provincial election that we had in the autumn, the #1 environmental issue was the Coastal Protection Act. So the PCs didn't commit to it, but the other two parties did say that was their main part of their climate platform, was that they were going to enact the CPA. There was also a study done by Narrative Research, and this EAC was behind. We didn't do the actual research. We just hired Narrative Research to do it for us. But they, in that, they did some polling across the province, and 86% of Nova Scotians see coastal protection as important. 68% of Nova Scotians think that the government should still implement the Coastal Protection Act. And even those that voted for the Conservatives, half of which wanted the Coastal Protection Act still. So even among Premier Houston's voter base, there is still quite strong support for the CPA. There's still continued media coverage, which is awesome. Every once in a while we see a new story. And again, EAC isn't even behind a lot of this. It's just because this issue is so important to folks. People go to media with their stories and with their concerns. And also we're seeing this continued engagement from communities. So yeah, definitely this conversation is alive, and people are really passionate about it. And as much as the government has been stubborn on it, people are being stubborn right back. They're really pushing that they want this because they see the value, and they want safety for their communities and for their loved ones. And then I always like to end presentations with some calls to action, because sometimes we can be talking about these big topics and it's like, well, that was frightening, now what? So these are things that you can do if you want, if this is of interest, and yeah, you just find your calling here. One is to continue to engage with the provincial government. So talk to representatives, your MLAs, about the importance of coastal climate change adaptation through legislation. I think what the climate plan, or the coastal protection plan, sorry, and the support that the provincial government is giving to municipalities through having blueprints of bylaws and some small financial support. I think all of those things, them in itself, are actually positive things, but we still need the provincial legislation, because even if we had the provincial legislation, these municipalities could still pass their own bylaws if they felt like it needed to be strengthened or needed to adapt to the needs of those specific communities. So it still very much is a provincial issue. Oh, and if you have, I've had this question a lot before too, and I am talking to a Halifax audience here, but if you don't have an MLA that's part of the Conservative Party, and they might be NDP or they might be Liberal, it's still worth talking to them as well. It doesn't have to be a Conservative MLA. It's worth them knowing what matters to their constituents. In a similar vein, talk to your municipal councillor and warden. Just have those conversations, say that they matter. And by talk, you can have a meeting with them, you can phone them, you can email them, whichever way suits you best. If you're interested in learning a little bit more from different professionals and also community members, and you felt like you wanted to join the Coastal Coalition, my colleague Nick, the other person that's on the coastal team at EAC, he's part of that, so I can always get you get you connected to him, sorry. And then get in touch with the media if you know of stories, or if you hear of stories that should be covered, and support the groups that are on the front lines of coastal climate change adaptations. That could be EAC, but there's a lot of other groups as well that are doing really important things. Some of them are, official charities, but then some of them are just like grassroots community groups, and they're doing amazing work as well. And then lastly, spread the word. Just have a conversation with your friends or your enemies. And yeah, the more, I think the important thing is the more we keep this conversation alive and just keep remembering the importance of fighting this fight. That's how we're going to get through it, because it has been a hard year. And there have been moments of frustration, but at the end of the day, this is a really important issue. And this isn't just for us in this present moment, but it's also for future generations. So, and I believe that is my last slide. Yeah, so thank you. I don't know if I went over time. I wasn't timing myself, so I apologize for that.